From the college by the lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to the North Idaho College Public Forum. On today's program, we're very pleased to have three guests, and the reason they can be with us is that we're happy to welcome to our city, at the time of the taping of this program, the 46th Annual Pacific Northwest Political Science Association Conference. During that conference, we have had the opportunity to interview guests for this week and again next week. On the first program, we're going to discuss international politics or international relations. And we're so pleased to welcome to the program three very distinguished political scientists to our guest panel, Dr. Orville Cope, who is a professor of political science at Albertson College. And next is the co-president of the Pacific Northwest Political Science Association, Dr. Donald Balmer, who is with Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. And next to him is our guest from our neighboring Canada, also the co-president of the association, Dr. Terry Morley of the University of Victoria. Gentlemen, you're on a very tight schedule, and it's very nice of you to come by our studios and to discuss international politics with us. And if I may, Dr. Morley, I would like to start with you. And again, welcome to our city, our state, and the United States.
It's beautiful here today.
On the time of taping this program on Friday is just preceding it's on the eve of your election, really, on the following Monday. So some of the things we talk about will obviously change by the time that we air the program. Would you take our viewers through what is going on in domestic politics in Canada at the moment? And you really are evolving into, apparently, at least temporary, a multi-party system that will affect that election. And I have a very involved question in the sense, how will that election affect the relationship with the United States and even other parts of the world? Is there change coming to Canada with this election?
Well, there's certainly change coming. We have had for the last 9 years really, a conservative government. And this time, all the polls indicate that the Conservatives will finish fourth in terms of seats. The Liberals are likely to win the most seats, followed by a party in Quebec that is determined to take Quebec out of Canada, party called the Bloc Québécois. If they don't come second, then another new party, the Reform Party, which is based in the West, particularly in British Columbia and Alberta, but it has strength elsewhere, will win a significant number of seats, again according to the polls, but I don't think the polls will be wrong. And the Conservatives, though they may have more votes in the country, but the way our electoral system works means that they're likely to get fewer seats than the first three parties. And finally, we have had a social democratic party, somewhat like the British Labour Party or the Swedish Social Democrats, for over 50 years, that's been in the House of Commons and played a significant role, but this time they look as though they're going to do badly and may end up with fewer than the 12 seats that you need in order to be granted official party status. Now, what does that mean in terms of our relationships with the United States? Well, the Liberals will form the government. They're split. Some of them, indeed, are not happy with the free trade agreement, feel, as many Canadians do, that the United States is a bit overpowering. But other Liberals do not share that view. I think those are likely to be the majority in Mr. Chrétien's cabinet. And so I think we won't see much change from the Conservative days. Perhaps there won't be as friendly a feeling as there was between Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Bush, Mr. Reagan. On the other hand, Jean Chrétien will identify to some extent with President Clinton, and I think it will be essentially business as usual in terms of our attitude towards the rest of the world. As with other countries, the end of the Cold War means that we don't want to spend money on military hardware. The Conservatives had intended to buy new helicopters, very high technology helicopters. That scheme, I think, is going to go by the wayside. the Liberals will drop it, and indeed we will cut defense spending. We won't have the same presence in Europe. I think, but all of that is really dictated by the Cold War. There won't be a huge change in terms of our external relations. There will be, however, a very significant change inside the country with these new regional parties, one of which is intent on destroying the country.
It is very, if I can say this and then get back to you, Dr. Bowman, but it's very unusual for in such a short period of time to be such major changes in historical parties. And so when you indicate that this is on the eve of happening, that and it's going to change domestic politics so drastically, will that in the long run, however, make additional, more significant changes in foreign policy?
Well, it will depend, of course, on what happens in the long run and whether the country stays together,
Right.
and what role the Reform Party gets to play. But I don't see there being significant changes in terms of our relationship with the United States. If anything, the most anti-American party was the NDP. They will obviously play a less significant role than they have. I think the free trade agreement, therefore, is not in any jeopardy. And indeed, despite the best efforts of the NDP in this election to have NAFTA as a major issue, it has not been. And I think Canadians will see it as the decision being made in the Congress of the United States.
Dr. Bowman.
I was going to ask Terry, the world has come to depend on Canada in a special way for peacekeeping forces because it's probably the most respected country in the world, democratic, constitutional country, not associated with colonialism or exploitation in the ordinary way. So if you cut back on your forces, will that diminish your participation in these multinational forces around the world? Or?
Well, we'll be torn. There's a lot of pride in the peacekeeping effort, although some of that pride has been damaged by unhappy incidents in Somalia, where we now have soldiers on trial for basically for torture and for a killing. And people are unhappy about that. Moreover, we face an enormous debt crisis, and I know that Americans feel the same. But our debt crisis is perhaps, if I may say, more significant than yours. Some economists would say 3 times more significant if you count all the public debt in Canada. Provincial governments have done a heavy borrowing, particularly the large province of Ontario. And in that kind of situation, you're always looking where you can cut, and there will be many voices to say we can't afford to do this peacekeeping, and if the world wants us to do it, then they'll have to pay for it.
So there are changes coming everywhere. Dr. Cope, I'll go to you with the next question. As Dr. Morley just indicated, there are major changes in emphasis in Canada. There are major changes in emphasis. It's very similar in this country where President Clinton came in and was emphasizing domestic problems and less attention to foreign policy, and certainly a reduction in some of the military aspects of our programs. One of the things that's come out this conference that I find very fascinating, and again, this is a very involved question, but is that as we take a look at a new world with the collapse of the Soviet Union and apparently 15 new countries there, and the collapse of Eastern Europe, and now we have in these, I don't know what you call them, brush fires in places like Haiti and Bosnia and so forth. What like Dr. Morley has just done, what is happening to the foreign policy of the United States, and again under a new president who's trying to find his way?
Well, Bill Clinton has inherited the New World Order, which, as we look at the secessionist movements in the world today, is not necessarily new, and certainly with the brush fire wars that you mentioned here, it doesn't look very orderly. Mr. Clinton's primary concern, I think, for his foreign policy is his economy, the economy of the United States. I think that we have our debt crisis and our fiscal problems, our monetary problems, and I think that if we're going to be a major player in a shifting multi-power situation or a multipolar situation where Japan, the Far East, maybe even China are going to be major players, we've got to put our economic house in order. Another problem I think that's facing the Clinton administration, it does not have an overarching concept which drives foreign policy. We use containment as the concept for over 40 years in our dealings with the Soviet Union, in our attempt to thwart the advance of communism in the world. We don't have the luxury of that single word that has some meaning that serves as a king bolt, if you will, of American foreign policy. He used a term several weeks ago in which he said that American foreign policy would be driven by enlargement. And that term was defined, or seems to be defined, as the United States advancing democratic institutions and market economies throughout the world. If that is the case, you still have to deal, I think, with anticipated reaction to your policies in different types of cultural and political environments. The problems in Bosnia are different from those of Somalia, and those are different from the ones in Haiti. And I think probably the Clinton administration has really got to get a handle, I think, on a driving concept. Now, there are those who are arguing that, we have to take it as it comes. We have to deal with things on an ad hoc basis. I'm not sure that that's the way to go about driving a foreign policy that is in which you are held accountable to the public. And I think that perhaps Mr. Clinton has got to reshape his foreign policy advisors and get them out into the open, I think, to begin to articulate a more profound interest of the United States in international affairs.
Dr. Ballmer, I'd like to get your opinion on this whole area too, and that is, as Dr. Cope was talking, I was thinking about, as we all look inwardly, and apparently many countries are doing this because of economic problems, how do we deal with ongoing and changing world? And Dr. Cope brought to my mind the idea is that if we just concentrate solely on domestic issues, there'll be many things happening out there. Mischief activities can lead to different kinds of alliances and down the road other problems. But at the same time, can we be the fire station and personnel that's putting out fires all over the world? Is there any way of gelling all this together in some kind of uniform policy?
Well, we hope so, although we're not sure of that. I think we must get our domestic house in order, and I think the movement on health care, for example, and something will happen. It has to happen. We can't develop our economy. We can't get firms to put people on 40-hour weeks and keeping them on 19-hour weeks who'd have to pay fringe benefits. Once we get some of that, that will help us in our world trade, our own development, our own sense of security. And in many ways, Franklin Roosevelt, and I suppose before him Woodrow Wilson, achieved world fame because they did something for their own people. And the world said, yes, that's the kind of thing we'd like to happen in our country. So we see the United States as a friend, perhaps, or as a model, even though we're larger and wealthier. So that will be helpful to the foreign policy, both in terms of getting our mind clear and getting world support. But within that context, we are faced with the fact we're the last great power now. That is not the final one, but the one that's left right now that can function, although we worry about those 20, 30, 40,000 Soviet missiles in whatever hands they are. But
they're rusting, though.
They're rusting, and we're sending people over to help them. And of course, that means they will fall apart in their own backyard. We're torn with the experience of history, and that is many scholars say, on the one hand, we have the Munich Pearl Harbor approach. If you appease dictators and try to get along with things you know are wrong, given our values, and what maybe the world aspires to, you're just postponing and making things worse. And the other side is the Vietnam syndrome, namely, we may be a superpower, but we can't do everything. We don't even know how to do it or what to do it in the particular situation, in Bosnia, in Somalia, and what is our national interest. And so we're torn by history. President Clinton's a Rhodes Scholar. He knows history, unlike many of our students who come to us from our high schools, unfortunately. And maybe they're better off because they don't know history, because we don't know which part to draw on. But I think that around the president, there has yet to emerge a group of advisors, I think, as Dr. Cope points out, who will be able to say, this is the American interest, these are the limits of what we can do and can't do, this is where we do things unilaterally, and this is where we do things with NATO, maybe expanded to include the Soviet bloc, former Soviet bloc. This is where we're under UN command, or we don't send anybody, but we donate and we send other peoples.
And Dr. Morley, I would return to you to get your comments in the same area. We just talked a minute ago about Canada not being willing, apparently, in the future because of economic problems to do some of the things they did internationally. What is the feeling from you personally as a political scientist, and then maybe from the perspective of your country, on some of these issues, regardless of what the role of the United States or Canada is, of how we're going to deal with them in the future?
Well, it is a puzzle because I think there are powerful political forces pulling in both directions, as Professor Ballmer outlines it. On the one hand, there is the sense that you need to intervene on behalf of your values. And on the other hand, there is what we used to call, and what is properly called, an isolationist sentiment in the United States, but in other countries as well. Now, look, we can't be the fire station, or certainly not the policeman. And yet, in certain kinds of conflicts, it is only the United States that could fulfill that role. And those of us in other countries recognize that. And yet we also know that it's going to be very difficult for any American president to act in the light of the domestic political situation, where if the isolationists are not a majority, they are a very powerful voice to say that we have so much trouble here, there are so many difficult domestic problems to be resolved, that how can you possibly put significant resources into solving somebody else's problem? And of course that gets particularly acute when those resources would include the resources of an armed forces, and people get killed, and your own people get killed. It's a very hard thing for any president to contemplate what they say, the body bags. I noticed Bob Dole talking about the body bags in terms of the Haiti resolution. And that's pretty emotive after Vietnam, and I'm not sure how a president transcends that and overcomes it. And yet, there are no other options in certain circumstances for the world in resolving these conflicts other than letting them, letting the fires burn.
And there must be a number of political leaders or revolutionary types around the world that are very cognizant of this and find this a prime time in which, within their own locality, to become involved. There is another area I want to get into and get all of your reactions to that. In addition to those fires that are burning in certain places that might require not only economic support for the military action, but, as you said, lives involved. As we look at the struggle in what is now Russia and what Mr. Yeltsin has gone through recently with the oligarch communist, and also a lot of supporters of democracy are also concerned with what Mr. Yeltsin's doing in relation to the press and so forth. But there is a school of thought in this country, and I'm sure in Canada and other places, that now is an opportune time to have increased funding to help Russia directed toward democracy, that the economy will have a lot to do with that. Or in Eastern Europe, I have some people I have interviewed recently that are from here going to Eastern Europe, just trying to do the building blocks of how you create local government and consumer groups and so forth. How do you all of you react to that? On the one hand, we don't seem to have any money to put in there, but is that nearsighted? What will happen in the future if we don't address that problem now? Orville, would you like to go first?
I think to comment on that, it's a little bit difficult. We've had the focus through the media on whether the Yeltsin government is democratic or not. There's real serious difficulties, I think, in established legitimacy of political institutions. They've been governed by the 1978 Constitution. There's supposed to be a new Constitution. I don't know whether it's going to be instituted before these December elections or not. If it is Mr. Clinton's concept that enlargement is to be instituted, I think that in some way we would have to provide reinforcement for the development of democratic institutions and a market economy, in particular perhaps to teach Russians distribution systems. They understand productivity. They need the wherewithal and the capital in order to do that. And perhaps private capital from Germany and elsewhere is not going to be sufficient. And also some other problems here that fall over into the area of law enforcement. Mr. Yeltsin has asked for greater powers for the prosecutors in order to go after individuals who practice just modern thuggery, I suppose, in their business dealings and that sort of thing. I think from the American perspective, we probably ought to look at economic help and technical assistance to Russia as a first priority. There is a lot, I think, to be gained in regard to that, and even in terms of world security, in regard to nuclear weapons, in regard to what is emerging in the Far East. I do really think that a Chinese century is coming, and I think that power politics are going to be just as essential in the future as it has been in the last 45 years.
The weapons situation is very scary, and and besides that, the Soviet or Russian resources are very huge. They're one of the world's largest oil producers when things work. Now they've really ground way down, and alternatives to the Middle Eastern situation would come with investment. We don't have that much money to help put them in it. And sometimes I think of people trying to understand how this happens. Let's take most of the Northwest in the United States is owned by the federal government. Supposing we privatize that. And supposing it worked out that, say, the local Forest Service people just say, okay, we'll take the forests. And somebody else says, we'll take the airports. And then the professors here say, we'll take the college. And then we'll start selling, charging people for what they once had. That's what's happening in these countries, and the most ruthless people in some cases are getting it. People who've stolen money, people who've come back from Eastern Europe point out who has the money. Well, the prostitutes, the drug peddlers, the people who had cheated in the previous system, and now they're suddenly the new entrepreneurs that we're sort of lauding. And that we know that it took our own country decades to get the democratic institutions that we now think we always had, which we didn't have. And to help us find out what this would be good economics, say, for the United States, President, who, as I was pointed out to our conference, President ran behind, got fewer votes than every member of Congress and every senator of his own party. So he's 43% of the vote. He's in no position really to lead and say, you must, in America, tighten your belts, spend some money, believe us, this will save you, maybe save our lives, save the planet, and certainly pay off in 20, 30 years. I just have come this day from a panel, and they were talking about the Supreme Court, and one of the leading observers just back from 6 years in Washington, a political scientist, was saying, well, we may well have the next president a Republican. So we're talking about somebody who's got a time horizon maybe of another 2.5 years.
But I think Eastern Europe gives Bill Clinton a real opportunity. And I think that's because the problems are immense and complicated, but not in fact as immense as the problems of underdeveloped third world countries. There is in fact the prospect that money, profit, which is dear to the American heart, and so it should be, can be made in terms of an economic relationship with many Eastern European countries, and certainly with those in the former Soviet Union, because they do have resources. You're quite right. They don't have a proper distribution system. But if they were to, if the United States and other countries could help with technical assistance and some capital to allow that to happen, then there will be a return. It's hard to see how we would get a similar kind of return in terms of Africa, though for humanitarian reasons there is every compulsion to do something in Africa. But here, it seems to me politically, even if in a semi-isolationist mood, people in the United States can be persuaded that this will work, that the return is important. And I think that what Bill Clinton has to do is he has to do something about the kind of morass that his foreign policy has been in for a while, and whether that's his advisors, I don't know. But he's got to take charge, to take hold of that. And here's an area where he could make a real difference.
In his heart, he's very much an activist president, we discussed last night, and I think that he certainly has the ability to convince the American people about foreign policy options and goals, just as he has done on health reform. I have one question for some member for Don here. I perceive something happening in Washington where public policy is being made in a different way than in the past. That there's a lot of initiation from the White House with its establishment of individuals and commissions to investigate different options under health reform, and I'm just wondering, do you perceive that as well? Does this make it more difficult to get it through future reforms through the House of Representatives?
Because it's initiated from the White House
Yeah,
instead of...
well, from the White House, plus the fact that you have these various citizens, and along with Hillary Clinton making certain types of decisions, or at least
I think
discussion.
it may help. I think you mentioned that Clinton is an educator, and the two of them together are awesome in the health insurance area, and people can be taught, and he is masterful at working the kind of talk shows, the formats where he walks amongst the people and indicates he knows the price of hamburger meat, as he would say. He knows the situation. He's able to draw out of them. I think he has the potential for leading, starting with this very low percentage and moving up, because he gets close to 50% approval rating, and people begin to understand these are difficult problems, and they may not find anybody else who can try them better, so that but the interaction with the public through television and talk shows, which is a big force in Eastern Europe now and other places, makes it a new dimension. Now, he may be the new kind of president, just as Ronald Reagan, by chance, having been in radio and motion pictures and then in television, was in a position to make the best use of those forms. Bill Clinton comes as really the first post-World War II president, and the first really is this modern president with these skills, I think, more so than Jack Kennedy, perhaps.
Dr. Morley, we're almost out of time, but do you see some plan in place soon that will address what your colleagues said concerning what kind of priorities are we going to have? You sound like Europe would be the number one.
I think Eastern Europe is one that it has to be high, because I think it can be successful. I don't expect there's a plan in place at this point, and I think that needs political will. But to be fair, I would have, if I were advising Bill Clinton, I would have said health care first. Other things need to follow. But now he must not just be reactive in terms of foreign policy. He needs to be proactive, and he needs to have some kind of plan. And I think if he does that properly, his allies, people in my country and in other countries, will applaud it.
And that sounds like get an order of priorities that you're going to work on in foreign policy. I've got the signal that we're out of time. Gentlemen, it's been exciting to have you here. You've been extremely articulate and informative. I know our viewers have learned a lot. And once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Orville Cope, Dr. Donald Balmer, and Dr. Terry Morley for being with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, as I indicated at the beginning of the program, we're at the 46th Annual Pacific Northwest Political Science Association. We shall return next week and discuss some domestic issues in U.S. politics. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.